This is Dan Schneider, and on this Dan Schneider video interview, I will be doing the second of my interviews in my George Dickerson project. This is a series of archival interviews about the life and career of the actor, the writer, diplomat, George Dickerson, who died earlier this year in the year 2015. And the man you see on your screen is Ed Shiller, an associate and friend of Dickerson, and I will be talking with him. Well, Ed, welcome, and thank you for spending your time to talk to me about George Dickerson and your relationship with him. Let me just start by asking you, how did you and George Dickerson meet?
Well, we met in January 1958. I was a student, a high school student in sophomore year at a place called the Woodstock Country School in Woodstock, Vermont. It was a very small co-ed boarding school, about 100 students in all grades 9 to 12. George came in the beginning of that winter as a teacher. He was teaching algebra and English, I think, and I was in his algebra class. And when I took an immediate and intense dislike of him. I don't know about the same. I think I was a thorn in his side. And I disliked him, but I did. And so I was acting out in his class. I was disruptive. I was being a nuisance. I was also 15 years in fact, how I would act as a 15-year-old who had a grudge or a chip on his shoulder. Anyway, what happened was a sort of a breakthrough thing, and I think this tells a lot about George and how he relates to people and the world around him. Because one day in his class, and I was acting like an idiot, and he said, Eddie, he said, I don't think you want to be in this class. And I said, something to the effect of, no, I don't. And he said, well, you don't do this. What do you mean? He said, well, you can go out and just leave. You don't have to be here if you don't want to. And then I questioned him about David, who was the headmaster. It was running school. We call it the teachers by their first name. And he said, no, this is just between you and me. And so I walked out of the class, and I remember sitting in the common room, which was empty then because everybody else was in class. And I sort of stood there, and I began thinking, wait a minute, you know, nobody had ever really taken me seriously this way, just sort of accepted me as I was. He was not being judgmental, he wasn't angry at me, he was just sort of mocking me. And I began thinking, you know, there's something about this guy that's probably really good to know. And I made a conscious decision then, and I would get to know George, and almost immediately, whatever animosity I was feeling about him just left. And so I went back into the class. And we really became friends ever since. I guess we were friends for about 57 years, really, today, before his death.
And what was the name of the school again?
It was the Woodstock Country School in South Woodstock, Vermont.
Okay.
And yeah.
Now, as you became an adult, what was your relationship with George then?
It was an on and off relationship. The relationship really built in the school, and he was there for about a year and a half. So he was there from January 58 to end of the term, the end of the school year in 59, and I just had that one course with him. But he and his first wife, Lucy, shared an apartment which was adjacent to the boys' dorm. And every evening, a lot of us would go over there. You know, we finished with the last study hall, and we'd have about half an hour, 45 minutes before our lights out, and we'd often go into his apartment. Know each other, and would do this. And I remember one couple of things really striking. I remember he had his first novel. I can't remember the name of it. It was never published. It was a novel. It was a series of vignettes really taken from his time when he was in a military hospital, served in the military just at the end of the Korean War, so this would have been around the end of '53. And each chapter was really a vignette. And I remember one of the chapters, Chico, later presented as a short story, and I think won him an award as best short story, I think, for I forget the year, maybe 1963, whatever it was. And I remember lying on, sort of stretched out on the floor of his living room with the manuscript in front of me, just reading the manuscript. He came up to me during, the afternoon and said, "Ed, make sure you come over tonight. I have a very good friend coming in from Montreal, a would-be poet." And it turned out to be Leonard Cohen, who was then completely unknown. So there were about, maybe 4 or 5 of us in total were over there that night. And I was sitting around thinking, what should we do? And somebody had the bright idea, let's read from a play. And the play we selected was Cyrano, because it was something that he had multiple copies of. And since there were so many of us, we made a share of 200 copies. And they're all in different translations, of course. As we began reading, there were all the disjoints in, the language, and the cues were a bit different, and from the different translations, which created a really hilarious night. And I just remember all of us sort of rolling on the floor in laughter and giggling. And it was one of the few times I really seen George just sort of going and sort of system of belly laughter and almost childlike giggling. It was really funny. Then I stayed in the school the year after he left. So, he moved to New York in Greenwich Village. I remember he had an apartment on Minetta Lane, and I think at that time, when I first met him, his daughter, Rachel's daughter, was just born, or at least she might have been pregnant. I really can't remember, but there was an infant there. And then a year or two later came Lisa, the second one. To go on vacations and visit George in New York. And we would just chat, and he would talk to me about the novel, the next novel he was working on, and I was sort of an acolyte, sort of soaking it in. And I remember one day just walking just alone. I remember Lucy in a cart around Washburn Park. Later that summer, after I graduated from high school, I went off to Europe, sort of a graduation present from my parents. And I came back and called up George, and Lucy answered, and saying that George and Lucy. And I didn't see George, I guess, at that point for maybe about a year or two, until around 1962. I went off to university, come back to New York and met him up. So we got together, I remember, for an afternoon and shared old times, and then I lost touch with him for about 4 years, until I got back to New York, and then gave him a call. And he was living actually then at the place where he lived the rest of his life on Bleecker Street. And we started up our friendship. Really consisted mostly of, I'd meet him either in his apartment, or we'd go down and meet in Figaro's, or King John, or any of the various coffee houses that George sort of lived in, really, homes away from home. And we would just talk about life.
And what do you do for a living, Ed?
I started out life as a journalist. Okay. I worked as a copy editor man at the New York Times News Service. I was a reporter at the Baltimore Sun. I went on to Copenhagen for 5 years, where I wrote for a number of newspapers, for the New York Times of London. I was the writer correspondent and had a news show on Radio Denmark. Then in '76, I came to Toronto to work for the Toronto Star, and I was there 5 years, and my final position was as deputy birthday editor. Then I left journalism, went into PR, and started my own firm, with a one-man firm of a time that I had employees. In 1984, that's what I've been doing ever since.
Okay. So by the mid '60s or so, I guess you had gotten into journalism. By the let's go, I guess, to the late '60s, early '70s. I know George worked as an editor at several magazines and then publishing houses, Cavalier magazine and whatnot. Did you ever cross paths then in the literary world in New
Well,
York?
I mean, I didn't work with him. I knew about it. He would tell me, I think Scholastic magazine was one. And I remember it told that I sort of saw that part of his life for him, maybe a little bit frustrating, because he would get these jobs like at Scholastic, and then it would fold, and he would get a, he'd call in as an editor of another magazine, and it folded. So he was, very successful. He was the kind of guy that I don't know underneath whether how insecure, certainly on the surface, he was always very conscious and very able. He was a very, very bright guy. He was very proud of his IQ. He would say it was 100%. And I remember he would tell me some of the stories, about there was one time, I don't remember what stage of his life was, but it's something he was telling me in the late 60s. That he was looking for a job, I think, on a cruise ship or something. It was and required him to know some German. And the interviewer was questioning him, and he just decided to go in and answer him in German, and so he got that job. And he's going really for the job, I think, all the time trying to build up a career as a writer. At that time, I don't know when he really began to write poetry almost exclusively as a writer, although he was always writing screenplays. But I remember this time it was more short stories and trying to develop novels. And he would write, he was successful in short stories. He was writing, he was a very good writer. So he had some success, but I don't think it ever got to the point where he could, fully live off of the income. So he was always getting other jobs. The last job that I knew in my stage of seeing him in the late 60s, was as a literary critic for Time magazine. And then I went off to Denmark for 5 years, so it was a while before I saw him.
What was your relationship with his first wife, Lucia, and did you know her well, and his kids, his daughter Rachel, and then what is the second daughter's name?
Lisa.
Lisa. Okay. Did you know them well?
I knew them. I really knew them mostly in conjunction with George, although I did get to know Lucy briefly in an intense experience. When I from Israel, I mentioned, and Lucy and George were separated, and Lucy and the two kids were living in a flat in Upper Manhattan. It was a very hot summer, and I remember my mother suggesting that I invite Lucy and the two kids out to our house for the weekend. We lived in Long Island on the North Shore. And so we spent a weekend there, and I got to know Lucy really for the first time, not in conjunction with George. It wasn't a very long relationship. It lasted 2 or 3 weekends. And so, I still remember exactly the things that we talked about, although maybe things I do remember that I don't want to be specific. The kids seemed to enjoy it, and I remember Rachel, we used to call her Mustard. And I haven't seen Rachel since probably then.
Yeah.
So it was 1960, until George's memorial in March of this year.
Yeah.
And the last time I had seen Lucy was in she's Lucy and now, but she's Lucy then, so that's what I call her.
Okay.
In 1983, and I just met her briefly, just to say hello. I was going off to Europe then. I was taking a freighter to London, and she was working at a clothing store on 3rd Avenue in Manhattan. And I just went there, we chatted for a couple, said goodbye, and then I went off to my career. And I had
Oh, so Lucille was at George's memorial as well.
Yeah, she was there, and Rachel was there. And I remember sitting there, and Rachel and Lucy, other close family members and friends were sitting up sort of on the stage in front, and I was in the audience. And I was looking there and saying, okay, which one? And the only one I could recognize, who I thought might have been Lucy, was Rachel. They looked very much alike, but she was very reminiscent of what Lucy looked like, back 5 years earlier when I seen her. And I remember thinking, but it can't be Lucy because she's too young. I mean, Lucy would be in her mid-70s at this point. And her friend was there, I just didn't recognize her. And I don't think I would recognize her if I ran into her on the street, not from my memory. She just changed from the way I remember her looking, although her daughter.
Yeah. So you were in Denmark for 5 years. When was the next time you saw George? Would have been the mid-70s?
Yes, it would have been. I came from Denmark in '76, then went up really to come to Toronto to work for the Toronto Star. That's what brought me back. I got on the Star. And I'm trying to remember the next time. I know in the '60s he was to Victoria, who was his third wife. And then when I came back, I don't remember exactly the next time, but it was certainly after back from Lebanon. And so it would have been in the late '70s, perhaps. And then a few years went by and I hadn't seen him. And then the next time when I really began seeing him on a more regular basis, I was in Toronto and I was in New York on a business trip. At this time I had left the Toronto Star and I was working as public affairs director for a mining company called Paulson. And I was in New York on business. And I had a, extra evening or two, so I kind of put that together again. And I remember that evening because I was at a formal dinner and wearing a tuxedo. And so when I met George down in the village afterwards, I was wearing my tuxedo. And so that was the first time I'd seen him in probably, several years. And then, we began talking a little bit then. I would come into New York once or twice a year. And every time I'd go and I'd see him. And the way it worked was this. He was a night owl, as I am. And so the best time you could get him would be 11 o'clock at night or so. So if I were in New York, I'd give him a call saying I'm in town. Can I come on up? He'd say, yeah, come up. So it was maybe 10:30, 11 o'clock. And I'd go up and sit in his kitchen. And by this time, he was now married to Anne, his fourth wife. And George and I would sit in the kitchen. Maybe Suzanne would join us for a while, and then she would go up to sleep, and we'd talk till about 5 in the morning. And that's when we caught up on things. And I remember he would show me some of the stuff he'd be writing and ask me to read it. I remember he had a short story. In fact, it was somebody had read from that at his memorial. I can't remember. It's funny. I can't remember the name. The Man with the Butterfly.
Yeah.
And it was funny because I was reading in the story, and this is really an autobiographical story about when he was in Lebanon, and apparently he was captured, taken prisoner for a brief while by one of the warring factions, and thrown into the cell with these guys. So the story was about one of these guys was a Dane who collected the name of butterflies in all the different languages. And so when I was in the middle of reading the story before I got blind, I said to George, he said, oh, the Danish word for butterfly is sommerfugl. And he looked at me, got very annoyed, and said, Ed, you ruined the story. Because that was the punchline. The dying words of the Dane were sommerfugl. And, the character, apparently after he gets released and he runs into a Danish woman, and he said, by the way, what does sommerfugl mean? And she said,
let me just ask you about the memorial. Where was it held, and how many people would you estimate attended?
It was at the Dickerson Memorial Church, which is Suzanne's church. Sort of a combination of American Baptists and Universalists. I'm not sure if she's from the Baptist side. And that's right in the village. I guess Washington Square South would be, West 3rd Street, just south of Washington Square Park, just bordering on Thompson. And there were about, at least 100 people there, maybe more. It was a rather big hall, and there were a lot of chairs around it. But I don't know around people there.
So it sounds like that you, it sounded like earlier you had said you sort of skipped over the second wife. You never met his second wife, I guess?
No.
No. Okay.
No, I never did. We were married only for about a year.
Okay.
So it's the only wife I didn't know.
Okay. So we're, I guess, in the early to mid 80s now. You said that you and George had sort of reconnected then for a few years. I know he had a period where he was having writer's block. Did he ever talk to you about that?
Yes, he did. This was really during the period when he did have that right. And what he was doing professionally at that time is acting. When he came back from Lebanon, and I really think I cannot imagine how he could survive emotionally from that experience. And he took up acting, and he was successful at it. He was in his mid-40s, deciding, I'm going to become an actor. And he does, and he's quite successful. Every once in a while, I remember I'd watch TV, and whoops, there is George. So that was what was occupying them. We didn't really talk about a writer's block. I didn't even know if he was aware of it then. We only began talking about the writer's block, and then he would talk about it. But I do remember one funny thing. He became friendly with Miller. And I remember in one of our discussions, it probably was after his own writer's block was ended. He was saying, one day, Miller called me up and said, I have writer's block, I can't write, and he was very frustrated. And so George was commiserating with him, and I just gave him some advice. But when that block ended, I think that really started or fueled the last part of his life and the last part of his career. Which I really had no part of. I wasn't, I did go through a period when I wrote some poetry in the early 2000s, and I remember showing a couple of them to George, and he said, oh, they're very nice, but not high off. He was a very firm and honest critic. He was harsh, but never malicious, and not gratuitously upfront about it. But I remember his own struggle with writing, and it must have been maybe 5 or 6 years ago. My sense of timing, actually, I get all worse and worse. But he was talking about his poetry, and we were talking about Leonard Cohen. And he said, I was speaking to Cohen, recently, and I showed him some of my later work, and Cohen looked at me and said, George, you finally got it. And that was a very proud moment for George, getting that kind of validation. Cohen about his poetry.
What was the name of the person? Miller? I didn't get the first name.
Arthur Miller, the playwright.
Oh, Arthur Miller. Okay, Arthur Miller. Okay. Yeah, now that you mentioned, I do remember him saying that he did know Arthur Miller. I do remember he mentioned he was friends with the daughter of a famous person. Was it an actress? Did he ever talk about some of the people that he had known? Because it wasn't Charlie Chaplin's daughter, was it? No. He knew the daughter of a famous actor or a writer. It wasn't Tennessee Williams. I don't think he had any children. I'm trying to remember. I can't remember. But so
I can't think. But actually, if you want to check his Wikipedia page, it talks about a lot of things. But yeah, I did. I was always when he was going through his acting period, and I would ask him about what he was doing and tell me some of the experiences. And one I remember, which he had a very nice, soft feeling for Farrah Fawcett.
Yeah.
And no, I'll tell you why. It was about everything else, but because of her kindness. George really, very, he was, his relationship, I think, was really hard. What you see about people is acts of kindness. And he said he was in a movie with her. I forget the name of the movie. I never saw it since it ever came out. But he had one really significant scene in that movie. And it was a movie, that scene that was to be filmed outdoors, but the weather wasn't cooperating. And the director was on the verge of saying, okay, let's just cut this scene, let's just forget it and move on. And Farrah Fawcett, sensitive to George's position, came up with a suggestion. The director will film it indoors, and she persuaded him to do it. And that saved George's scene. He was very grateful.
So let's talk about then the 21st century, the last 10, 12, 15 years of George's life. What was your relationship in, the final years? Because I know I first encountered, I first found George's book of selected poems in the late 90s. And then when I started my own website, an arts and poetry website, about a year or so afterwards, I got an email from George, which he was very complimentary about the website and my poetry and whatnot. And then I interviewed him for an internet radio show in 2003, and I probably spoke with him 2 or 3 times a year for the last dozen years or so of his life. I know he had a lot of medical issues. He had something with his leg, some blood issues, I think. And so what were the last, 10, 15 years of your relationship with George like?
Well, I'll start with what you're talking about. He had serious illnesses which actually originated in his time in the Army when he was in the hospital. He had hepatitis C, he had, the disease of the colon, Crohn's disease.
Oh, okay, yeah, that's right.
And significant back pain. I remember, 2 or 3 times when I was up in his apartment and I was saying goodbye to him and I'd give him a hug, just to light up in pain. And one time must have been around, probably about 10 years ago, there was a little mini-min at somebody's house in Connecticut from people at Woodstock, from school. So George wanted to go, and I remember it was torturous for him in the car, for every bump in the car, it caused him a spasm. So that was the conflict with him. The thing with the leg, which was the only, I think, really did him in the end. I got a call from, in fact, I still have his message on my computer. I'm only right. It was in August, and he called up, and it was like, Ed, I'm dying. I'm in hospital. So I lived out of my car and drove straight to New York, not knowing whether I'd find a friend or a corpse. And I got to New York about 8 hours later, and he was in hospital. And he never gave the name of the disease, but it sounded very much like nephrotic fasciitis, and it went into his leg, and at one point, I spent really about 8, 10 hours a day. And I remember one time when his leg was unbandaged, you could see right to the bone. And it was a death struggle. It says about him, his tenacity. George was one of the people with tremendous inner strength. When he got sick, and the disease killed most people, or a significant number of people. And here he was just turned 81. He was advanced in years and ill from so many other things. That they first thought they weren't going to save his life. And then they thought they weren't going to save his leg. And George said, no, the hell with that. I'm going to save both. And he got out of hospital. And I think the crowning achievement of those last few months was climbing those 70 stairs. The bottom of Bleecker Street, up to the 5th floor where he lived on. Yeah. And the worst I counted them. And it took him 25 minutes, but he did it. So that was, that last part. But I would come up, I did once or twice a year, and it's little things I learn about him. Like, I always liked him in many ways as an iconoclastic individual. I mean, but I realized in a funny way that he was very stringent with certain rules. I think he always liked to do things his own way. So in his own personal life, it was very strict. And you do it George's way. And you just accept it. But I realized in other ways. I remember that it was in January, so it was the time when all the members of the Academy were voting on
Yeah.
Okay. Voting in the Academy, and so he had the book, which listed all the various people up to be nominated and then to be voted on, and they had all the DVDs. And I remember thinking, wow, you got all these DVDs, could I borrow one? He got Rick said, no way would I ever let you borrow that. You're only supposed to look at it yourself, and I'm not to jeopardize that. That's interesting, in terms of how I began George's relationship with the rest of the world, that in many ways he lived by rules.
Yeah.
Even though some of them might have been his own.
Yeah, I do remember him, and I talked many a time about his voting for the Motion Picture Academy stuff and getting DVD screeners and whatnot, and he took it quite seriously. I think in the last 10 years or so, that was probably the thing that he seemed to take the most pleasure in, I guess, was watching and voting the stuff for the Academy Awards. Yeah. Well, let me just, if you don't have any other stories, let me just ask you if you have, any final things you want to say about George.
So just one little incident. There's something else I want to say. Just also a sense of the way he is. It was one time when I was up visiting him, and I think it must have been in 2004. And my daughter was in high school then, and she had just done a paper on Death of a Salesman. And so I mentioned that. We conversation around the and I said, oh, Lisa, my daughter's name as well, my older daughter. And I said, she wrote her on Death of a Salesman. He said, well, maybe Miller would like to see it and look at it. And he got there and he wrote out Miller's address in Connecticut. And then he wrote it down. He said, give him a call. And he thought about it and said, no, I don't think you should call him. He crossed out the phone number. And he said, so I gave that information to Lisa, if she wanted to send it to him, but she procrastinated a month or two, and then that was the year that Miller died. But the one thing I want to say about George, just as a final thing, as a human being, very basic attributes of this guy, I think, which is what, for me in any way, cemented our relationship and what went on for George was, I don't want to sound trite, but probably one of the most tolerant, accepting people that I had ever met. He had very strong opinions about it, and he had a very strong sense of values of what was right or wrong. But he also had a deep respect for every other being on the planet and their right to be who and what they were. And because of that, I felt that I could always be very open to George, because I knew it would never be, judged by him. I mean, he might agree or disagree with what I have to say, but he never ever questioned the validity of it for me, as a person, and I think it's all other people. And I think this is why I see he had so many followers. He was a great mentor for people, and he encouraged people to develop their own abilities and their own talents. But this sense of being non-judgmental, it's rare. That I can only think of maybe one other now that I know that comes to mind that really has that quality.
Well, thank you, Ed Shiller, for sharing your thoughts about George. And this is one of an ongoing series over the next few months, maybe a year or so. I'll be talking with other friends and relatives of George Dickerson. And again, thank you for your time.
You're quite welcome. Thank you.